Alright everyone, let us settle in. Tonight, we will be exploring a topic that is a little less philosophical and a good deal more greasy. Medieval junk food. Even in a world without fast food chains or vending machines, people still discovered ways to enjoy a snack. And I must say, some of it was delicious, some of it was rather strange, and all of it was profoundly medieval. As you begin to get comfortable, I invite you to like this video and subscribe, but only if you feel a genuine connection with the stories we share here. I'm always fascinated to know where you're listening from, so feel free to leave a comment sharing your corner of the world. Now, go ahead and dim the lights. Perhaps the gentle hum of a fan can join us in the background as we drift smoothly into tonight's journey together. In a world where most snacks were of questionable appearance and often tasted even worse, apple fritters were a rare and wonderful exception. Sweet, hot, and just a little bit dangerous, much like any good medieval decision. These golden, disc-shaped treats were the closest equivalent to a medieval donut, though they lacked frosting and modern food safety standards. So, what exactly went into a fritter in those days? Apples, of course, but not the shiny, polished kind you find in a supermarket. Imagine small, tart, noble fruits that grew behind the local alehouse, perhaps discreetly acquired from a neighbor's tree. They were roughly chopped and folded into a coarse batter of flour, eggs, and sometimes ale, because drinking water was always a risk, and ale simply made everything feel a little more cheerful. Then came the frying, and deep frying in the 1300s was a special kind of culinary performance. The oil, typically rendered pig fat, was reused until it was likely old enough to have its own opinions, adding a distinct flavor, a generous description for it. But the result was something hot, crispy, and strangely addictive. A fritter fresh from the pan was a small moment of pure joy, with its crispy edges, a soft center, and a faint possibility of a third-degree burn. If you were fortunate and wealthy, it might be dusted with imported sugar, a luxury that also served as a display of social standing. For everyone else, a drizzle of honey or spice syrup would do just fine. Either way, it was sweet enough to distract you from the rest of your diet, which consisted largely of cabbage pretending to be something else. Fritters were essential street food. You would find one at a fair, after church, or on market days when you were craving a treat and did not mind a bit of grease on your tunic. Children loved them, adults adored them, and birds were constantly trying to steal them. They were fun, fast, and just indulgent enough to make you forget about the pickled turnips waiting for you at home. And yes, sometimes they were overcooked, or the apples were more sour than sweet, or the batter was suspiciously chewy. But when they were good, they were truly exceptional. One bite, and you could suddenly understand why people endured medieval life. If apple fritters were the medieval version of a donut, then cheese curds were something like medieval popcorn. Bite-sized, slightly squeaky, and wonderfully inconsistent. They were not flashy, they did not melt, and they did not stretch. In fact, they did very little at all, and that was their perfect charm. Let us be clear, medieval cheese was not aiming for visual perfection. It was made quickly, eaten even faster, and was expected to withstand long journeys, questionable storage conditions, and the occasional goat stepping on it. Cheese curds were essentially baby cheese, the fresh, early pieces before the wheel hardened into something that could double as a building block. These small clumps of dairy delight were a natural byproduct of the cheese-making process. Farmers would separate milk into curds and whey using rennet, which sounds sophisticated until you realize it came from the stomach lining of a young animal. But it worked. The curds were lightly pressed, salted, and then that was it. You had cheese curds, sometimes soft, sometimes rubbery, and sometimes they audibly squeaked against your teeth as if they had a personality of their own. But they were filling, portable, and oddly satisfying. In a time when a snack usually meant old bread or cold broth, curds felt like a genuine luxury. Monks loved them, travelers packed them, and children would eat them like candy, assuming the cows had been cooperative that week. You could fry them, crumble them over stews, or simply eat them by the handful while trying to ignore the fact that you smelled like the inside of a barn. Unlike many medieval foods, cheese curds did not require a special celebration. They were not reserved for holidays or saints' days. They were just there, comforting, familiar, and mildly chewy. The reliable friend who always shows up, never overdoes it, but is strangely dependable when everything else seems to be falling apart. Did they sometimes taste a little off? Certainly, freshness was a flexible concept in the Middle Ages, but with enough salt and enthusiasm, most people did not complain. Besides, in a world without refrigeration, one's standards naturally adjusted. So no, cheese curds were not glamorous, but they were simple, hearty, and just indulgent enough to qualify as a treat in a pinch. They were also excellent for bribing cats and small children. Turnips are most certainly not a dessert. Let's just start with that. But in the medieval world, where sugar was incredibly expensive, apples were not always in season, and creative desperation was a primary food group, someone somewhere looked at a turnip and thought, what if this were a pie? And so the turnip pie was born. Now, to be fair, it was not always terrible. Sometimes it was even somewhat enjoyable. Imagine mashed turnips, hopefully tender, blended with a bit of egg, and perhaps some honey or dried fruit if the cook was feeling particularly generous. This mixture was then baked inside a sturdy crust made of flour, water, and sheer ambition. The result? Surprisingly edible. At its best, it was warm, a little sweet, and had that vaguely comforting quality of a root vegetable trying to be a pudding. At its worst, it tasted as if someone had mistaken livestock feed for a baking ingredient and just decided to go with it. Turnip pies were popular for two main reasons. Turnips were inexpensive, and a pie crust could effectively hide a multitude of culinary sins. Whether the turnips were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter, once you baked them into a pie and added a drizzle of honey, it transformed into peasant cuisine with aspirations of grandeur. Was it as good as cheesecake? No, but it tried, and in medieval Europe, effort counted for a great deal. You would find these pies at fairs, on feast tables, and in particularly enthusiastic monasteries where the monks had a bit too much time on their hands and a lot of extra root vegetables. Some recipes even incorporated spices, nutmeg if the abbey was wealthy, pepper if the cook was feeling chaotic. Occasionally, raisins made an appearance, which only served to confuse people further. Nobles did not typically eat turnip pie unless they were trying to experience life as a commoner for amusement or feigning relatability for political reasons. But for everyone else, it served as a form of dessert, or more accurately, an afterthought wrapped in pastry. And yet, despite its questionable logic, the turnip pie endured. People tolerated it, or at least they did not dislike it enough to stop making it. It was cheap, filling, and mildly sweet, which for medieval food made it practically revolutionary. If the medieval world had a most valuable comfort food, it was undoubtedly the meat pasty. A handheld pie generously filled with seasoned meat, encased in a folded crust, and baked until it was golden brown or slightly charred. In essence, it was a medieval hot pocket, but without the microwave and with a genuine sense of risk. The true beauty of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, or even while watching a public execution, whatever the day's activities required. Wrapped in a thick pastry crust, it stayed warm for a considerable time and protected its contents from dirt, opportunistic rats, and the occasional sneeze from a fellow peasant. But let us discuss the filling. The term, meat, in this context was remarkably flexible. If you lived near a manor or a hunting estate, you might get pork, mutton, or venison, actual recognizable meat. If not, well, the options expanded dramatically. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog. Anything that once had legs or slithered could be diced, seasoned, and cleverly hidden inside the pastry with plausible deniability. Spices were often used to enhance the flavor or, more realistically, to distract you from it. Pepper, sage, and garlic certainly helped, but they could not completely mask the fact that the meat had been sitting for a few days longer than was ideal. Still, in an era when refrigeration was a distant dream and lunch often consisted solely of bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt genuinely indulgent. There were even vegetarian versions, filled with root vegetables, leeks, or cheese, perfect for fasting days or for the particularly devout. But make no mistake, the meat versions were the undisputed crowd pleasers. They were greasy, hot, and profoundly comforting. You did not ask about the specific contents. You simply ate it and hoped the cook had been in a good mood. And in case you are wondering, yes, people sometimes marked the crust with initials or symbols to claim ownership, especially among miners and laborers. In some regions, the crust was intentionally made extra thick along one edge, allowing it to be held with dirty hands and then discarded for the spirits or, more realistically, for scavenging rats. So, were they good? Often, yes. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was part of their charm. You did not eat a meat pasty to feel safe. You ate it because it tasted good and you were prepared to accept the consequences. In a world where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing medieval people had to breath mints. Tiny, sugary, and vaguely herbal, they were part treat, part digestive aid, and part dental hazard, all wrapped up in a single oddly satisfying crunch. These small seeds were typically coated in a hard shell of sugar, which was no simple task in the Middle Ages. Sugar had to be imported, boiled, meticulously beaten, and poured by hand, which meant that someone, somewhere, truly believed in the potential of these tiny snacks. They were especially popular in noble households, where guests might be offered a small dish of them after dinner to freshen their breath and, perhaps, to distract from any lingering pieces of mutton between their teeth. Flavor-wise, fennel seeds had a strong, licorice-like taste. You either loved them or politely swallowed them whole and nodded in gratitude. The sugar coating helped, but there was always that unmistakable herbal kick, the kind of sensation that made you feel both fancy and slightly confused. Candied seeds also served a practical purpose. They were believed to aid digestion. People thought fennel helped to settle the stomach, especially after a heavy meal involving 3 types of bird and an alarming amount of mead. Think of them as the medieval version of chewing gum crossed with an antacid, but with a greater potential to chip a tooth. And yes, they were hard enough to crack a molar if you bit down too confidently. You did not casually chew candied fennel seeds. You cautiously tested one first, gently bit down, listened for any cracking sounds, and then fully committed. It was a risk-reward situation every single time. While the wealthy enjoyed them like medieval breath mints, common folk occasionally managed to acquire knockoff versions, usually involving honey, crushed herbs, and a healthy dose of optimism. Not quite the same, but good enough to pretend. In the grand lineup of medieval junk food, candied fennel seeds were small but mighty. They did not fill your belly, but they left a pleasant taste in your mouth and gave you the illusion of refinement, even if you were covered in mud and still had goose grease on your tunic. If medieval desserts had a star performer, it was undoubtedly the honey cake. Sweet, dense, and prone to sticking to everything except your expectations. Honey cakes were the result of bakers getting ambitious in a time when sugar was still largely confined to the treasuries of castles. Honey was the sweetener of choice for the common people, assuming those people had access to bees, or were not afraid of climbing trees and getting stung in the face. These cakes were typically made with flour, water, and generous spoonfuls of honey, or at least what passed for spoonfuls in an era where spoons were mostly used to fend off siblings. The result? A firm, chewy slab that could be either a delightful snack or a makeshift doorstop, depending on how long it had been sitting near the hearth. Spices were sometimes added if the household was feeling wealthy or wanted to show off. Nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon could give the honey cake a bit of flair, and by flair, we mean the ability to cause the entire village to discuss your recipe for a week. Dried fruits were also occasionally tossed in, if they had not already been stolen by local children or fermented into wine. Honey cakes were popular at feasts, festivals, and weddings, primarily because they could be prepared in advance, did not spoil quickly, and could easily survive being dropped on the ground, stepped on, or even thrown at someone during a mild food fight. They were also used as gifts, bribes, and occasionally as passive-aggressive statements like, "Here, I made this for you. It's sweet, unlike your personality." Structurally, they were not what you would call delicate. Many resembled compact bricks, requiring a sturdy knife and the quiet hope that no one was watching you struggle to slice them. Eating them was simpler. Just do not expect a fluffy bite. These cakes were built for medieval life. Tough, durable, and coated in enough sticky honey to make your hands feel as if you had lost a battle with a beehive. But they were satisfying. They tasted of warmth and indulgence, like those rare moments when you were not chewing on salted barley or chasing rats out of your cupboard. They were joy wrapped in sweetness, with just enough chew to count as a workout. Fried fish skin cracklings, possibly the most unexpectedly delightful snack to emerge from a culture that also thought eel pie was a good idea. These crispy, salty little strips were not glamorous, but they were a perfect example of the waste not, want not philosophy, especially when you were working with a fish that frankly smelled as if it were judging you. Let's be honest, no one intentionally set out to invent this. More likely, some thrifty cook was left staring at a pile of discarded fish skins and thought, what if we just fried it? A splash of hot fat later and history was made, or at least something vaguely edible was created. Fish skin was plentiful, especially in coastal towns or near rivers where herring, cod, or whatever had been pulled from the water was processed on site. The meat went into the stew pot, the heads went to the cat, and the skin was tossed into a pan of bubbling oil and sizzled into submission. The result was surprisingly addictive. A thin, crispy snack that crunched like a dried leaf but tasted of the concentrated ocean. A pinch of salt elevated the experience, and a hint of garlic or herbs. Well, now you were approaching culinary excellence. These cracklings were not just tasty. They were practical. Lightweight, non-perishable, and high in fat. Exactly what a medieval body craved after a day of hauling firewood or defending sheep from someone else's sheep. Soldiers packed them, sailors subsisted on them, and peasants sold them outside taverns for a few coins and the satisfaction of feeding drunk people something louder than their own conversations. Did they sometimes still have scales? Yes. Did they occasionally curl into strange shapes that made you question your life choices? Also yes, but by medieval standards, they were downright elegant. Crispy, flavorful, and unlikely to give you dysentery. The only real drawback was the smell. These things could announce their presence from 3 huts away. If you fried a batch indoors, your home would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a solid week, but you would be forgiven because they tasted good. When life gave you stale bread and warm beer, you did not cry. You made the most medieval snack imaginable. Bread soaked in ale, known variously as soups or trench toast. This humble creation was the original comfort food. Think of French toast, but without the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or sense of joy. Here is how it worked. You took yesterday's bread, the kind that could double as a building material, and dunked it into a bowl of ale. Not a fancy craft ale with notes of citrus and a hoppy finish. No, this was flat, low-alcohol medieval ale, brewed in someone's smoky back room with the hygiene standards of a barn owl. The bread absorbed the ale like a sponge with trust issues. It softened, swelled, and transformed from a jawbreaker into something vaguely edible. Was it tasty? In the right light, with a good mood and low expectations, yes, it was in a way. It was warm, bready, and carried the gentle bitterness of fermented grain, which is to say it did not actively offend the palate. This snack was especially popular with the working class, people who did not have time for multiple courses or cutlery but still needed calories that would not fight back. Bread soaked in ale was quick, hearty, and just messy enough to feel like a real break from your daily chores. Sometimes people added extras, a sprinkle of herbs, a bit of cheese, or a fried egg if the hen was feeling generous that morning. On feast days, you might even get soups soaked in spiced ale, which basically meant the cook had found a shaving of nutmeg somewhere and gotten inspired. And like many medieval dishes, this one had a dual purpose. Not only was it food, it was also a way to stretch your ingredients. Bread too stale to chew? Just soak it. Ale starting to turn? Pour it on the bread and pretend it was intentional. Waste was for amateurs. The only downside was its poor portability. Once soaked, the bread turned into a kind of sloshy porridge cube. You had to eat it quickly or risk ending up with a mushy sponge in your bowl and a 1,000-year-old metaphor for disappointment. Still, for a chilly evening by the fire, nothing could beat a slice of ale bread mush and a moment of peace. If you have ever looked at a slice of bread and thought, this would be better if it were submerged in alcohol, congratulations, you and the medieval upper class have something in common. Sops and wine were one of the more refined, or perhaps more bizarrely specific snacks of the Middle Ages. It was a dessert, technically, or maybe more of an experience. The concept was simple. Take bread, ideally toasted or at least not completely stale, and dunk it generously in wine. Not just any wine, of course, but usually a sweet or spiced wine. Something warm, fragrant, and barely concealing the fact that it had been sitting in a clay jug since the last harvest. Once the bread was sufficiently drenched, it was served as a soft, spoonable delicacy. Nobles called it elegant. Everyone else quietly wondered if the cook had simply run out of ideas. This was not finger food. It was the kind of dish you ate with a spoon very slowly, while pretending to be interested in the lute music playing in the background. It appeared at banquets, late-night feasts, and those awkward dinners where no one wanted to discuss politics. So instead, they passed around soggy toast in a goblet. When prepared well, sops and wine were warm, comforting, and mildly intoxicating. A gentle end to a heavy meal. The wine added richness, the bread provided texture, and the spices made you feel as if you were part of something much fancier than it truly was. When done poorly, it was simply wet bread in a bowl, and no amount of cinnamon could mask the feeling that you were chewing on a medieval mistake. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were added for flair, sometimes cheese, and occasionally even a whole egg, at which point it ceased to be a snack and became a culinary guessing game. Peasants created their own versions, usually using cheap vinegar or ale instead of wine. It was not dessert. It was dinner or breakfast, or whatever you could call a meal that left you both full and confused. Still, sops and wine had staying power. They were warm, they were filling, and they offered medieval people a taste of indulgence, even if it did taste like a sponge soaked in mold and regret. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a prized treat. Sugary, exotic, and shelf-stable enough to survive an entire crusade. But let us be clear, this was not your modern trail mix with its charming, resealable packaging. Medieval dried fruit had one primary job: to last. Taste was optional, the texture was aggressively chewy, and dental damage was practically a guarantee. Let's start with the basics. You had your usual suspects: raisins, figs, dates, and if you were truly fancy, imported prunes. These were fruits that had been sun-dried, smoked, dehydrated, or in some cases, simply forgotten on a windowsill until they no longer qualified as moist. They were wrinkled, tough, and alarmingly dense, kind of like an edible time capsule from the last harvest. The upside? Dried fruit was sweet, incredibly sweet. The concentrated sugars transformed these shriveled little things into medieval candy. Nobles loved them, monks hoarded them, and children treated them like rare loot from the kitchen. The downside? Chewing them was like battling your own jaw muscles. Figs came with seeds that doubled as medieval dental floss, and dates were sticky enough to glue your molars together. Raisins stubbornly clung to your teeth for hours. There was no such thing as snacking quietly. Still, dried fruit had its moments. It was used in pies, added to porridge, or chopped up and mixed into honey cakes to create the illusion of variety. Wealthy folks might wrap them in pastry, drizzle them with rose water, or soak them in wine, as if trying to impress a guest from Florence. For commoners, getting your hands on dried fruit was a special occasion, usually a holiday, a wedding, or that one day a year when someone remembered you existed. When that happened, you would eat it slowly, respectfully, possibly while hiding in the barn so you would not have to share. Storage was easy. Dried fruit did not spoil quickly and was often kept in small cloth sacks or clay pots. It hardened over time, yes, but that just transformed it into a longer-lasting snack or possibly a projectile if you were creative and had younger siblings. In short, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and faintly dangerous. It stuck with you, sometimes literally. You wake up hungry, craving something hearty, something fried, something that might just bite back. Enter the blood pudding ball. A medieval snack so dense, so bold, and so unapologetically iron-rich that it makes modern sausage rolls seem like timid breadsticks. Born from the noble tradition of using every part of the animal, these savory spheres were living proof of the waste not, want not philosophy, even if what you are not wasting is blood. Let's break down the preparation. First, you collect fresh animal blood, usually from a pig, though honestly, any blood would suffice in a pinch. You then mix it with oats, onions, suet, which is beef fat, and spices. Once that morbid porridge reaches just the right level of grim stickiness, you shape it into balls and fry them in sizzling fat until the outside crisps up as if it has something to prove. The result? Dark, crispy orbs of protein-packed sustenance with a rich, earthy flavor, which is code for You'll taste iron and mystery for the rest of the day. They were best served hot, fresh from the skillet, though sometimes they were eaten cold if your hunger outweighed your fear of congealed fat. Nobles might dress them up with pepper or serve them with eggs and ale. Peasants were simply content not to be chewing on boiled cabbage again. Blood pudding balls were not elegant, but they were practical, easy to carry, high in calories, and alarmingly filling. If you ate 2, you could easily skip lunch. If you ate 4, you were probably a blacksmith or trying to win a dare. These snacks were common at fairs, markets, and roadside stalls, where everything smelled of livestock and ambition. They were especially popular in the colder months, because what truly warms the soul like fried coagulation? Of course, blood pudding balls were not for everyone. Some people did not appreciate the texture, while others did not quite embrace the concept. But in a world where survival came first and flavor ranked somewhere around 12th, these meaty little morsels earned their rightful place in the medieval junk food hall of fame. Forget everything you know about pancakes. These were not fluffy stacks served with maple syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, tougher, and cooked in enough lard to make your arteries consider early retirement. But they got the job done, and in a world where your other breakfast option was a thin soup that was perpetually sad about its own existence, they were kind of a treat. Made from a humble mix of flour, eggs, and water or ale, these pancakes were poured onto a sizzling iron griddle that was generously coated in bubbling pig fat. There were no non-stick pans, no portion control. You simply ladled and hoped for the best. The result? A flat, uneven circle with crispy, browned edges and a slightly chewy center. The kind of pancake that could survive a horseback ride and still be mostly edible upon your arrival. Sometimes it was a little burnt, sometimes a little raw, and sometimes, charmingly, both. The flavor depended entirely on what you had on hand. A splash of ale added a nice tang, a spoonful of honey was a luxury, and a sprinkle of herbs or onions was considered adventurous. But most of the time, it was just pancake and grease, served hot and inhaled as if you had just outrun a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. Everyone ate them. Peasants, nobles, monks, and merchants. Some layered them with cheese, some dunked them in broth, and others simply rolled them up and called it a day. You could eat them sweet, savory, or scorched beyond recognition. And if you had leftovers, you could stack them up and pretend they were a cake or even a piece of armor. They were especially popular during Lent and other fasting days when meat was off limits. Pancakes became a convenient loophole, fried, filling, and somehow both humble and indulgent. Plus, they made excellent vessels for disguising other ingredients that had no business being in your mouth. And while they might not have been beautiful, medieval pancakes possessed a remarkable staying power. They did not require praise. They just needed a hot pan and a willing stomach. Somewhere between a snack and a sacrament, we find the medieval wafer. A thin, crisp, suspiciously light biscuit that delicately balanced on the line between a dessert and a serious dental challenge. Wafers were ubiquitous, sold outside churches, at bustling village fairs, in the hands of monks, and occasionally floating in your soup like a flat, holy crouton. Let's be clear, we are not talking about chocolate-dipped, cream-filled delights. Medieval wafers were made of flour, water, eggs, and not much else. If you were feeling fancy, you might add a dash of honey or rose water, but most people stuck to the basics. A thin batter was poured onto hot metal wafer irons and then pressed between 2 scorching plates, much like a medieval panini press. The result? Something that looked as if it belonged in a communion ceremony and tasted like crispy paper with aspirations of greatness. Wafers gained popularity because they were portable, quick to make, and, best of all, could be sold in massive quantities for a tidy profit. Vendors would set up outside churches on feast days, waving stacks of warm wafers at the faithful as they exited Mass. "Buy now, sin later" was not the slogan, but it certainly captured the general vibe. They were often shaped with religious symbols, floral patterns, or the vague imprint of a saint's face, depending on the design of the iron mold and how tired the baker was. These designs did not enhance the flavor, but they did give you something to thoughtfully stare at while chewing and pretending you were not disappointed. Structurally, wafers were delicate. They would crack if you looked at them the wrong way and shatter if you tried to break them cleanly. Storing them was a challenge, and transporting them was even more so. which made eating them outdoors a high-stakes affair involving crumbs, wind, and a sense of regret. Still, they were beloved, light, crispy, and vaguely celebratory. Wafers were the medieval equivalent of treating yourself without completely wrecking your digestion or your wallet. For nobles, they came stacked with fruit or layered with soft cheese. For everyone else, they were sold by the dozen in street stalls and eaten immediately before they disintegrated into edible confetti. Suck it. Even the name sounds sticky. This medieval treat was essentially fruit that had been boiled into submission, drowned in syrup, and sealed in a jar like a sweet little hostage. Think of candied oranges, dates, or ginger coated in enough sugar to make your teeth tingle and your conscience whisper, "You probably shouldn't be eating this." But you did because it was delicious, probably imported, and also you did not have much else. Suck-it was not for the everyday peasant chewing on his seventh onion of the week. No, this was elite-tier snacking, the kind of indulgence served in noble halls or gifted by the wealthy to convey the message, "I like you, but not enough to give you a piece of land." Sugar was expensive and fresh fruits were not always in season, so suck-it was reserved for special occasions like weddings or royal visits, or perhaps a random Wednesday if you were outrageously rich and completely out of control. The preparation process was ambitious. First, you would boil the fruit in syrup, maybe honey, maybe refined sugar if your spice merchant owed you a favor. Then you would drain it, allow it to dry a bit, and repeat the process several times because once was simply not enough. You were not just preserving fruit, you were declaring war on moisture itself. Eventually, the result was a glossy, jewel-toned bite of candy. Chewy, intensely flavorful, and so sweet it could probably be weaponized in large enough doses. Some versions were soft and syrupy, served in ornate glass jars. Others were dry, rolled in extra sugar, and handed out as dainty little cubes of medieval hypoglycemia. But make no mistake, suck-it came with status. It signified that you had access to sugar, extensive trade routes, and at least one servant dedicated solely to stirring things that stubbornly refused to be stirred. Suck-it trays were passed around after banquets like edible gold coins. Guests would take one piece, smile graciously, and immediately regret not discreetly grabbing three. As for the commoners, they watched from the kitchen and perhaps licked a spoon if no one was looking. So, was it worth it? Honestly, yes. Suck-it was one of the few medieval snacks that genuinely felt like a dessert. It was rich, refined, and just extravagant enough to compensate for the fact that your dinner had included something boiled. Fried eel, the grand finale of medieval junk food. It was a dish so strangely beloved that it journeyed from humble peasant hearths to opulent royal banquets without once pausing to ask, "Wait, am I really the best option here?" Yes, it was. Eel was ubiquitous in medieval Europe. The rivers and streams practically writhed with them, and they were easy to catch, inexpensive to cook, and, when fried, surprisingly crispy. Slippery when raw, bonier than expected, and shaped like the villain in a fish-themed horror story, eel was nevertheless consumed by the bucket load. Why? Because it was tasty, and more importantly, it was not turnips. To prepare it, you would first have to catch the eel, usually at night when they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. Then came the unpleasant task of skinning them, which was less like preparing a fish and more like wrestling a wet rope that adamantly refused to die. Once subdued, the eels were chopped, seasoned if you were feeling bold, and tossed into hot fat until the skin crisped up and the meat firmed into something vaguely appealing. The finished product was a crunchy, savory bite with a rich, slightly oily flavor, like if calamari and chicken had an identity crisis in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel was served at fairs, feasts, roadside inns, and, believe it or not, during religious fasts. That is right, eel was not technically considered meat, so it slipped through the dietary loopholes like an eel. Monks ate it, nobles flaunted it, and kings had it stuffed into pies and paraded across banquets like the sea serpent it always wanted to be. Sure, it had bones, lots of them, and yes, it occasionally wriggled long after it was dead. But if you could get past that, and the haunting feeling that you were consuming a villain from a cautionary folktale, fried eel was genuinely delicious. Crispy on the outside, tender on the inside, and just greasy enough to make you feel as if you were living a little too dangerously for a Wednesday afternoon. Today it might seem bizarre, but back then, it was a delicacy. a slippery little miracle that kept bellies full and menus delightfully weird. In the ancient world, Mesopotamia stood at the crossroads of mystery and mythology, and nowhere was this more evident than in how they viewed dreams. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream was not just a private, meaningless experience. It was a divine telegram, a supernatural email sent directly from the gods to the subconscious. And ignoring it, that was akin to leaving a message from the god in Lil unread, a dangerous proposition. By around 2500 BCE, the Mesopotamians had developed a full-blown system of dream interpretation, meticulously recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script. These were not bedtime novelties. They were actively used in statecraft, medicine, and religious rituals. Kings would delay wars if a troubling dream suggested bad omens. Farmers would not plant their crops if they saw a goat flying across the sky in their sleep. The world, they believed, was constantly communicating, and it was your profound responsibility to listen with your eyes closed. Professional dream interpreters, known as Baru priests, were the ancient equivalent of Freudian analysts, but without the couch. They were rigorously trained in extensive libraries of omen texts, like the Ishkar Zakik, an elaborate dream manual that categorized dreams and their meanings in sometimes absurd but eerily precise ways. Dreaming of eating dates? A good omen. Dreaming of your teeth falling out? Expect a death in the family. Dreaming of having relations with a goddess? Well, congratulations. You were either divinely favored or cursed with arrogance. These dream books did not claim to guess at meanings. They presented cause and effect as if dreams were mathematical equations. A equals B. See a snake? Expect betrayal. Fall from a rooftop? A lawsuit is coming your way. The world of dreams was logical, but it operated on a divine logic that was far stranger than human reason. But the Mesopotamians did not stop at interpretation. They also practiced dream incubation. If a ruler wanted guidance from the gods, he might sleep in a temple under special circumstances, undergoing fasting, cleansing rituals, perhaps offering a few incense offerings, and patiently waiting for a revelatory dream. The idea was that certain environments made the divine connection stronger, clearer, and less prone to nightmares about drunk goats. For the Mesopotamians, the dream world was not a mystery to be solved. It was a realm to be navigated with caution, reverence, and the aid of a very large library of clay tablets. They believed the gods were always speaking. You just had to be asleep to hear them. In ancient Egypt, dreams were not merely nightly occurrences. They were considered sacred texts in motion. The Egyptians believed that dreams were direct messages from the gods, from revered ancestors, or even from one's own Ka, the spiritual double of a person. Every dream, whether good or bad, carried intent. It could warn, bless, instruct, or terrify. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE, the Egyptians had begun meticulously recording their interpretations in what would become some of history's earliest dream manuals. One of the most famous examples is the Ramesside Dream Book, written on papyrus and discovered in the village of Deir el-Medina. This was not light reading. It was essentially a divine diagnostic tool, listing hundreds of dreams and interpreting each one based on whether the outcome would be favorable or disastrous. The logic, however, was not always intuitive. For example, if a man saw himself eating crocodile flesh in a dream, it was interpreted to mean that he would become a high official. Strange, yes, but in Egyptian cosmology, the crocodile was tied to the god Sobek, who embodied strength and power. Eating a crocodile meant absorbing its divine traits, a promotion-worthy omen. Each entry in the dream book began with the phrase, "If a man sees himself," followed by a symbolic scenario. These were not general guesses. They were drawn from centuries of ritual knowledge, personal visions, and temple tradition. And the interpretations were often binary, marked as good or bad in red and black ink. If your dream was classified as bad, it was time to light some incense and ask a priest to intervene. Priests in temple complexes, especially those serving healing deities like Serapis or Thoth, sometimes offered services in dream incubation, where supplicants would sleep in the temple and await guidance or healing through their visions. The idea was to open a divine channel through purification, prayer, and controlled sleep. This was not mere superstition. It was healthcare, divination, and theology all rolled into one night's rest. Dreams also influenced magic and medicine. Amulets might be prescribed to ward off recurring nightmares, and specific rituals could be performed to erase a dream much as you would erase a curse. For the ancient Egyptians, the sleeping mind was not idle. It was a stage where gods, demons, and the spirits of the dead could appear and offer glimpses into hidden truths, provided you had the wisdom and a priest to decode them. In the ancient Greek world, dreams were more than divine whispers. They were clinical appointments with the gods. Central to this belief was the practice of incubation, a ritual in which individuals would sleep inside a temple in the hopes of receiving a healing vision. And no deity was more closely tied to this practice than Asclepius, the god of medicine. At temples known as Asclepians, which dotted the Greek world from Epidaurus to Pergamon, the sick, the hopeful, and the desperate came seeking cures. But instead of pills or potions, they were prescribed sleep, sacred, intentional, and performed under specific spiritual conditions. Before entering the temple's sleeping quarters or abaton, a person would undergo purification, bathing, fasting, and sometimes sacrificing an animal. Only after these rituals could they lie down on a stone bed and wait for the god to appear in a dream. The results, according to inscriptions and ancient testimonies, were often remarkable. Some patients dreamed of Asclepius touching them with his staff or of snakes, his sacred animal, slithering over their bodies. They would awaken healed or, at the very least, believe they had received divine instructions on what to do next. Whether these dreams were real, psychosomatic, or driven by the placebo effect, their impact was profound. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, acknowledged the value of dreams in diagnosis. They did not dismiss them as nonsense. In fact, they believed the body could reveal its state through symbolic visions. A dream of flowing water might suggest kidney issues, while a dream of being crushed could point to a chest ailment. In Hippocratic texts, dreams were often classified as either natural or divine. Natural dreams were thought to be caused by diet, digestion, or emotional stress, while divine dreams were in a whole other category, direct messages from the gods or the cosmos. But not all dream interpreters wore white robes and carried scrolls. The oneirocritai, or dream readers, were the real stars of the public square, using dream manuals, omens, and an enormous supply of interpretive flair to translate dreams into warnings, blessings, or instructions. The most famous of these guides was the Oneirocritica, written by Artemidorus of Daldis in the 2nd century CE, a book that was still being studied centuries later. In Greece, a dream was not just a nighttime experience. It was a profound bridge between the mortal and the divine, between body and soul, and between illness and healing. And if you were lucky, you would wake up with a cure and maybe a snake curled at your feet. Throughout the ancient world, one category of dream carried more weight than all the others: the prophetic dream. These were not just messages. They were warnings, revelations, or calls to action. For cultures spanning Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams were sacred transmissions from a higher plane, direct links to the gods, to fate, or to the mysterious mechanisms of the cosmos. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, prophetic dreams were a recognized and respected channel of divine communication. The Old Testament is filled with examples. Think of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing before his own, a potent symbol of his future rise to power. Later, as an interpreter of the Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt, he predicted 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. That one dream of fat and thin cows altered the course of Egypt's economy. Joseph did not just read dreams, he became a national strategist by doing so. Likewise, in Mesopotamia, kings often received dreams that foretold victory, disaster, or divine favor. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal claimed that he saw the gods in his dreams, guiding him to success in war and governance. Prophetic dreams were seen as confirmation that a ruler had divine legitimacy, which was essential in a world where the line between king and deity was thin. The Greeks, too, recognized this prophetic potential. Dreams were categorized. Those that came from the subconscious were called inhypnia, but those that revealed the truth were called oneiroi alithanoi. These were not taken lightly. Before making major decisions, founding a city, declaring war, or launching a voyage, Greek leaders often consulted their dreams or those who were trained to interpret them. Dreams were so revered that they had their own minor deities, the oneiroi, winged spirits who entered a sleeper's mind with messages from the gods. Even the Romans, who were typically more pragmatic, took prophetic dreams seriously. The Emperor Augustus was said to have dreamt of future glory, and even Nero consulted dream interpreters during his reign, though perhaps not enough considering how that turned out. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, before decisively defeating Hannibal, reportedly had a dream of victory that was sent by the spirits of his ancestors. In ancient societies, prophetic dreams were not side notes. They were tools of power, instruments of policy, and evidence of divine selection. The fate of nations, the health of empires, and the rise of legends often began with something as simple as a whispered vision in the dark. While the Greek Asclepian temples are the most famous, the practice of ancient dream incubation was not exclusive to Greece. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, dream healing thrived in a rich blend of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, with temples and sacred sites dedicated to facilitating contact with divine forces through sleep. The most fascinating example comes from the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god who was associated with healing, cycles, and, naturally, dreams. His temples often sat on hills facing the night sky, as if they were positioned to catch lunar messages being beamed down into the dreams of the supplicants. People suffering from physical ailments, spiritual unrest, or uncertainty about their futures would come to these shrines to practice incubation, a ritual sleep with the hope of receiving a curative or guiding dream. The process was similar to what we saw in the Asclepian practices, but Anatolian incubation had its own unique twists. Worshippers would sometimes walk through labyrinthine paths or sleep beneath celestial carvings, believing that their proximity to this sacred geometry would help to focus the divine messages. Music, incense, and chanting were often used to tune the sleeper's mind to the divine frequency. This was not sleep for rest. It was sleep as a form of spiritual reception. Texts from the region also mention dream priests, spiritual specialists who were trained to guide and interpret these visions. Some would even seed the dreams, suggesting certain imagery or symbols before sleep to subtly shape the encounter. For example, someone who wanted a vision of their future child might sleep with a carved fertility idol under their pillow. If they dreamt of a lion, the priest might declare that a brave son was on the way. If they dreamt of rain, it might signify a daughter who would be blessed with growth and wisdom. Hittite records also reference divine encounters in dreams, especially among royalty. Kings and queens received strategic advice, healing knowledge, and occasionally harsh warnings from the gods in their sleep. One dream reportedly instructed a queen to adopt a foreign goddess into her shrine, an early example of divine diplomacy. Dream incubation in Anatolia was not just a personal experience. It was communal and cosmic. Pilgrims traveled long distances, often forming temporary healing communities that were bound not by blood, but by a shared sense of vulnerability and hope. And through sleep, they believed the gods could reset the course of their lives. In Anatolia, to dream was not a passive act. It was an act of ritual participation, where healing and prophecy flowed not from logic but from the silent language of sleep. By the 2nd century CE, the ancient art of dream interpretation had matured into a disciplined craft, and one man took it upon himself to systematize it all. Artemidorus of Daldis, a Greek from Asia Minor. Artemidorus was the author of the Oneirocritica, the most comprehensive and influential dream manual of the ancient world. And unlike the mystical scribes who veiled everything in divine mystery, Artemidorus approached dreams with the methodical precision of a scholar and the keen curiosity of a streetwise psychologist. The Oneirocritica was not some mystical pamphlet. It was a 5-book tome written in clear Greek, filled with thousands of dream scenarios and their meanings, which Artemidorus had meticulously culled from personal interviews, temple records, and public performances. He claimed that he had spent decades collecting dream accounts from people of all walks of life: sailors, merchants, prostitutes, and soldiers. His logic was clear. If you want to understand the soul of a culture, you must listen to its dreams. He organized the dreams into various categories: actions, animals, professions, bodily functions, and even types of relationships. Dreaming of flying? That could suggest either freedom or arrogance. Dreaming of being naked in public? Depending on your social class, it might mean shame or future power. Dreaming of your teeth falling out? That signified a loss, usually of relatives, a belief that seems to have stuck through the centuries. But what truly makes Artemidorus unique is that he emphasized context. Unlike earlier dream books, which often provided static meanings, Artemidorus stressed the critical importance of the dreamer's status, gender, occupation, and current life circumstances. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck might signify business troubles, while a poor man dreaming of the same thing might find new fortune. The interpretation was not one size fits all. It was tailored, almost like an early form of psychotherapy. Artemidorus also tackled symbolism head-on. He understood that dreams utilized metaphor and irony. A dream of dying did not literally mean death. It could signify renewal. A dream of sex did not always refer to carnal desire. It might signal dominance, power struggles, or guilt. His interpretations navigated a strange line between being deeply logical and incredibly bizarre. The Onira Critica was not just a curiosity. It was widely used for centuries across the Roman Empire and the Byzantine world, influencing medieval dream interpreters and being translated into Arabic, thereby keeping the flame of this knowledge alive long after the classical temples had fallen. With Artemidorus, the dream transformed into a text to be studied and decoded, not just for prophecy but for profound insight. He may not have believed that dreams came directly from the gods, but he certainly believed that they originated from somewhere deep, strange, and undeniably worth exploring. Not all dreams in the ancient world were considered gifts from the gods. Some were terrifying visions from the depths, dark, haunting experiences that were believed to originate from restless spirits, demonic forces, or even the underworld itself. These were not viewed as mere bad nights of sleep. They were grave warnings, divine punishments, or ominous omens of things to come. The Babylonians were among the first to clearly differentiate between dreams of divine origin and those that stemmed from malevolent forces. If a dream caused pervasive fear, illness, or profound distress, it was considered polluted, and a priest would be immediately summoned to perform apotropaic rituals. These were cleansing spells, protective offerings, or symbolic actions that were specifically designed to neutralize the dream's ill effects. For example, if someone dreamed of being chased by a demon, the interpreter might recommend sleeping with a protective amulet under their pillow or burning cedarwood incense to ward off evil spirits. The Egyptians also possessed a well-developed system for preventing nightmares. Certain dreams were believed to be caused by malicious entities, including the spirits of the dead. Amulets bearing the eye of Horus or images of Bes, the dwarf god who protected households from dark forces, were worn to guard against these attacks. Some people even recited dream erasing spells upon waking, treating the nightmare as a contagious curse that had to be verbally negated before it could manifest in the physical world. In Greek thought, nightmares often signified a message not from the Olympian gods but from the chthonic deities, the gods of the earth and the underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the terrifying Erinyes or Furies could appear in dreams to express divine displeasure or to signal a crime that had gone unpunished. Dreamers who ignored these potent warnings did so at their own peril. The philosopher Plato in the Republic even described the dream as a battleground between reason and appetite, where the lower parts of the soul ran wild. For him, a nightmare was not just a spiritual warning but a psychological one, an indication that your inner self was out of balance. Even the pragmatic Romans feared dreams of certain animals, like owls, snakes, or wolves, as signs of impending death, betrayal, or war. They believed that the dead could visit the living through their dreams, sometimes to warn and sometimes to accuse. In every ancient culture, nightmares were more than just bad dreams. They were seen as cosmic red flags, powerful reminders that the seen and unseen worlds were always intricately connected, and that even in sleep, there was no true escape from fate. In the ancient world, Dreams were not just spiritual. They were significant political assets. Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets often used dreams to justify crucial decisions, sway public opinion, or consolidate their authority. When the gods spoke in sleep, those in power were quick to declare, "They spoke to me." Take Alexander the Great, for instance. Before he conquered Egypt, he reportedly dreamed of the god Ammon welcoming him as a son. Upon his arrival at the Siwa oasis, the local oracle confirmed the dream, officially declaring Alexander a divine offspring. Whether the dream was genuine or strategically staged, it did not matter. The message solidified his rule and painted him as more than just a mortal, a living god in the eyes of his troops and subjects. Dreams were especially useful during political transitions or uncertain times. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamed of a great victory at Actium, which he subsequently won against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Afterward, this dream was immortalized in literature and on coins, transforming it into a sacred national narrative. Later emperors followed suit. If the gods supported your dream, who would dare to oppose your actions? Priests and oracles often played into this, with dream interpretation becoming a theological tool, especially when it aligned perfectly with the interests of a ruler or a temple elite. Suppose a rebellious governor dreamed of disaster. A priest might interpret it as divine punishment for challenging imperial authority. On the flip side, dreams of fruitfulness and victory, when interpreted correctly, could embolden leaders to launch new campaigns, raise taxes, or enact significant reforms. This was not limited to men. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt claimed in temple inscriptions that her very birth was foretold in a dream by the god Ammonius, who appeared to her mother and prophesied her divine rulership. By framing her reign as being destined in dreams, she profoundly strengthened her legitimacy on a male-dominated throne. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also used dreams to challenge kings. Daniel, for instance, interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue, precisely forecasting the rise and fall of empires. It was not just dream reading. It was geopolitics wrapped in allegory. In every ancient civilization, dreams allowed leaders to proclaim, "This is not just my will. It is the will of heaven." Whether it was a divine revelation or calculated propaganda, dreams were a powerful currency, transforming the subconscious into statecraft, one compelling vision at a time. Though the ancient temples have crumbled and the priests of dreams now sleep beneath layers of dust, the profound legacy of ancient dream interpretation lives on, subtly whispering through time, science, and psychology. Much of what we believe about dreams today, our enduring fascination with symbolism, recurring motifs, and even the nature of nightmares, has deep roots in the ancient frameworks that diligently tried to make sense of the sleeping mind. The medieval world inherited these traditions wholesale. Islamic scholars meticulously translated the Oniricritica of Artemidorus into Arabic, refining and expanding upon it. In Islamic mysticism, dreams became deeply respected as a crucial means of divine guidance. Meanwhile, Christian monks and theologians began carefully cataloging the dreams of saints and martyrs, visions that often predicted future miracles or divine justice. The same core structure remained: sleep as a portal to the sacred, dreams as veiled messages, and interpreters as the vital bridge between the human and the divine. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and we encounter Sigmund Freud, who, despite explicitly rejecting religious interpretations, borrowed heavily from the symbolic structure that had been pioneered millennia before. In The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899, Freud argued that dreams expressed repressed desires and fears, but he still used ancient tools like metaphor, symbol, and narrative. His protege, Carl Jung, went even further, describing the dream world as being populated by archetypes, universal figures like the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man, which are eerily similar to the figures one might find depicted in a Greek temple or a Babylonian omen list. Even modern neuroscience, while stripping dreams of their mysticism, still respects their inherent complexity. Concepts like REM sleep, lucid dreaming, and the profound influence of trauma or memory on dream content. These ideas echo the ancient notions that dreams reflect both the health of the body and the state of the soul. Pop culture, too, carries on this torch. From film and literature to tarot and New Age spirituality, dreams remain a source of endless fascination. Whether it is a horror film based on sleep paralysis or a dream journal app that promises self-discovery, the ancient idea still pulses beneath the surface, that what we see in our sleep profoundly matters. In the end, the ancients may not have possessed brain scans or sleep labs, but they understood something that we are still diligently chasing today, that dreams are not random. They are stories, signals, or shadows, whispered in the language of the gods, our ancestors, or ourselves. The fundamental question remains the same across time. What is your dream trying to tell you? In the mid-19th century, the United States was a country that was stretching at its seams. By 1860, California had been a state for a full decade, but it often felt more like a distant cousin than a true sibling. The eastern half of the country was buzzing with burgeoning cities, ubiquitous telegraphs, and expanding railroads, while the vast western frontier remained rugged, remote, and painfully disconnected. A letter sent from New York to San Francisco could take 3 to 4 weeks to arrive, and sometimes longer if severe storms, unforeseen delays, or cunning bandits interfered. And that was assuming it arrived at all. The mail routes at the time were as convoluted as they were inefficient. The most common path involved ships carrying mail down the Atlantic, across the Isthmus of Panama, and then back up the Pacific coast. A journey that was fraught with delays, tropical diseases, and logistical nightmares. Meanwhile, the overland route by stagecoach was agonizingly slow, perilously dangerous, and frequently bogged down by muddy trails, snowbound mountain passes, or attacks from outlaws and the hostile terrain. This significant lag in communication was not just an inconvenience. It was a profound political problem. The federal government worried that California, increasingly isolated, might drift away in spirit or in loyalty. In an era when secession was already a dangerous possibility on the horizon, maintaining unity across the vast continent was not just ideal, it was absolutely urgent. Entrepreneurs and bold visionaries began to float audacious solutions, none bolder than the idea of creating a central relay system using the one thing the American West had in abundance: open land and exceptionally fast horses. If skilled riders could gallop across the country in rapid shifts, swapping horses at stations every 10 to 15 miles, just maybe, they could cut the delivery time from weeks to a mere 10 days. It was an insane proposal. The proposed route would span nearly 2,000 miles, from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. It would traverse towering mountains, vast deserts, treacherous rivers, and territories that had barely been mapped. There would be extreme heat, freezing nights, and the ever-present danger of ambush. But if it worked, it would be the fastest communication line ever established between the East and the West. The problem was clear. America was expanding faster than its infrastructure could keep pace. And so, with a mixture of desperation, ambition, and pure frontier daring, a solution galloped into history, one saddlebag at a time. The Pony Express was about to be born. The Pony Express did not just spontaneously materialize out of the dust. It was the audacious brainchild of 3 ambitious businessmen from the prominent freight and stagecoach firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, which was based in Missouri. This trio, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, were already seasoned veterans in the demanding world of overland shipping. Their company was responsible for hauling vital freight and government supplies across the wild American frontier. But in 1860, they set their sights on a far more radical and risky goal: drastically speeding up mail delivery to California in the shortest time possible. At the time, Russell in particular was under immense pressure. His reputation was on the line due to recent financial scandals and a string of failed ventures. He perceived the Pony Express not just as a patriotic service, but as a personal redemption arc, a way to restore his name and gain favor with the federal government. If they could successfully prove that their relay system worked, they hoped to secure a lucrative federal mail contract. Alexander Majors brought the crucial logistical brain to the operation. A devout and meticulously organized planner, he demanded unwavering discipline from his employees, even requiring his riders and station masters to swear solemn oaths against drinking and cursing. He also developed a highly structured system for the express, stations would be built every 10 to 15 miles, with larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles, and the entire route would be maintained with military precision. William B. Waddell, the quietest member of the trio, provided the essential legal and financial backbone. While Russell was the charismatic salesman and Majors was the operational genius, Waddell meticulously kept the books and ensured that the company remained afloat, at least for a while. Together, the three men poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the venture. They acquired over 400 horses, hired more than 80 daring riders, and constructed roughly 190 stations across the most remote and challenging parts of the frontier. They fully understood that it was a colossal gamble, and they knew the route would be grueling, but they also recognized that whoever successfully solved the communication crisis would earn a permanent, revered place in American history. And so, without any initial government funding, they launched the service themselves. It was a bold move, financially reckless, logistically insane, and yet profoundly symbolic of the American grit and pioneering spirit. In April of 1860, the Pony Express was finally ready to ride. The relentless race against time and the formidable terrain had officially begun. Creating the Pony Express route was akin to constructing a fragile bridge across an entire continent, with no safety net and almost no margin for error. The full distance spanned nearly 2,000 miles, stretching from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, through a dizzying array of diverse landscapes. Rolling plains, imposing mountain ranges, high deserts, and dangerous river crossings. To make this audacious idea work, the founders established a meticulously planned chain of approximately 190 relay stations, strategically spaced every 10 to 15 miles, roughly the distance a horse could gallop at full speed before tiring. Every 75 to 100 miles, a larger home station provided much-needed rest and shelter for the riders, where they could sleep, eat, and hand off the precious mail to a fresh rider. But the true backbone of the express was the horses themselves, more than 400 in total. They were chosen not for their looks or stature, but for their sheer speed and unyielding stamina. In the east, fleet-footed thoroughbreds dominated the prairie, while in the rugged west, compact and hardy Mustangs carried the mail across the mountains and desert. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. Riders would gallop at full speed, often jumping off their horse mid-stride and leaping onto a fresh mount in a matter of mere seconds. Each station had to be manned, adequately stocked, and securely fortified. Some were little more than sod huts or crude wooden shacks, while others were fortified structures surrounded by barbed fencing and guarded by vigilant station keepers who were armed with rifles. Essential supplies, water, feed, and food, had to be transported in advance, which meant months of meticulous preparation, all of which was conducted in some of the most remote and inhospitable land in America. The weather posed one of the biggest threats. Riders would endure savage blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, blistering heat across the Nevada desert, and sudden, torrential thunderstorms that could flood river crossings or transform dirt paths into impassable muck. Slipping off a horse in freezing conditions could lead to deadly hypothermia. One wrong move in a swollen river could result in drowning, and many riders came perilously close to it. Then there were the dangerous animals. Packs of wolves sometimes relentlessly chased the riders at night. Rattlesnakes coiled venomously in the trailside brush, and mountain lions stalked the high passes. But even more perilous than the wildlife were the cunning bandits and bushwhackers who knew that a rider's mochila contained valuable letters, some of which were even laced with gold dust or money orders. Although the riders carried revolvers, they were often outnumbered, and stopping meant risking both their life and their mission. Tensions with Native American tribes also escalated during the Pony Express's brief existence. The Paiute War in 1860, which was sparked by grievances over land, broken promises, and settler encroachment, led to several violent attacks on Pony Express stations. Riders were ambushed, station keepers were killed, and multiple stations were burned to the ground. The most famous episode occurred when Pony Bob Haslam galloped nearly 190 miles through hostile territory to deliver the mail, suffering wounds from arrows but completing his route regardless. Even sheer isolation was a constant danger. Riders were often alone for hours, with nothing but their horse, their weapon, and the looming darkness. A broken leg, an injured horse, or a missed station could mean dying alone in the vast wilderness, never to be found. And yet, despite all of this, the system admirably endured. Mail was occasionally delayed but rarely lost. Riders were sometimes wounded, but they almost always made it through. In 18 months of operation, only a handful of men were tragically killed on the job. The Pony Express was not a romanticized fantasy of the Wild West. It was a brutal, often terrifying reality. But in surviving these immense dangers, the riders became living legends, powerfully proving that even the most unforgiving terrain could be tamed, if only for long enough to deliver the mail. In a land where vast distances meant isolation, the Pony Express stitched together a fragile thread of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3, 1860, the Pony Express made its historic debut in St. Joseph, Missouri. A crowd gathered at the stables of the Pikes Peak Stables building, buzzing with palpable excitement. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry, though historical records are somewhat disputed, mounted his horse, took the leather mochila, a specially designed mail pouch, and dashed off westward at breakneck speed. The crowd cheered, cannons fired, and just like that, a new chapter in American history thundered to life. The mail bag that Fry carried weighed around 20 pounds and was filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams that were bound for California. A telegraph message had already been wired from Washington, D.C., and would now travel the remainder of the way on horseback, symbolically uniting cutting-edge technology with raw human effort. At the very same moment, a counterpart in Sacramento rode eastward, launching the bidirectional relay. Between them lay nearly 2,000 miles of unforgiving wilderness, 190 stations, and some of the harshest terrain that North America had to offer. And they planned to traverse it in just 10 days. Each rider on the route carried the mochila from one station to the next, leaping off a lathered horse and onto a fresh one in under 2 minutes. The mochila was ingeniously designed. It had 4 locked pouches and could be quickly slipped over the saddle horn without unstrapping anything, because speed was everything. Riders were expected to maintain a furious pace of 10 miles per hour, even in the dead of night, through driving rain, blinding snow, or hostile territory. Despite the inherent chaos, the first ride succeeded. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in 9 days and 23 hours, a triumphant achievement. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of modern communication, and the legend of the Pony Express was born almost overnight. Though only a few letters rode in that inaugural mochila, the symbolic impact was immense. It was not just about efficiently getting mail from point A to point B. It was about possibility, about powerfully proving that this wild, fractured continent could be connected, that man and horse could outpace isolation. For the riders, it was the beginning of a dangerous, thrilling chapter. For the nation, it was a taste of something new. Instantaneous communication, faster than anyone had thought possible. The West had just gotten a little smaller. The true lifeblood of the Pony Express was not the horses, the stations, or even the mochila. It was the riders. They were a daring band of young, wiry daredevils who defied treacherous weather, the unforgiving wilderness, and even war to deliver the mail. They were not just couriers. They were living legends in the making. The typical Pony Express rider was no older than 18 and often closer to 16. They were light, usually under 125 pounds, so as not to unduly weigh down the horses, because speed and endurance were paramount. The now famous recruitment ads allegedly read, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred." While the exact wording is likely apocryphal, the spirit behind it was absolutely real. These young men rode 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at every station but never resting until they had passed the mochila on to the next rider. They often rode through the dead of night, enduring torrential rain, blinding snowstorms, or scorching heat. They carried revolvers and rifles, but against bandits or hostile attacks, their best defense was sheer speed. Many of them traveled alone, often unarmed, relying entirely on their ability to outrun trouble. Some of the riders became genuine folk heroes. Pony Bob. Haslam once rode an astonishing 380 miles in under 2 days to deliver the mail during a violent Paiute uprising. He was wounded by arrows but completed his route regardless. William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later become a famous Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at the age of 15, though historians debate the accuracy of that particular tale. Regardless, the reality of their existence was already dramatic enough. The riders had to navigate the treacherous Rocky Mountains, cross the vast Great Basin Desert, and brave territories where the slightest mistake could mean freezing to death, drowning, or vanishing without a trace. And yet, despite all of this, the service maintained an astonishing rate of reliability. Mail was occasionally delayed but rarely lost. Riders were sometimes wounded, but they almost always successfully made it through. In 18 months of operation, only a handful of men were tragically killed on the job. The Pony Express was not a mere fantasy of the Wild West. It was a brutal, often terrifying reality. But in surviving these immense dangers, the riders became enduring legends, powerfully proving that even the most unforgiving terrain could be tamed, if only for long enough to deliver the mail. Though the Pony Express operated for only 18 months, its impact on the United States was swift, far-reaching, and undeniably profound. In a country that was teetering on the edge of civil war and desperate to feel unified across its vast landscape, the Express powerfully proved one thing loud and clear: distance was no longer destiny. Before the Pony Express, it took weeks for letters to travel from the East Coast to California. Important political decisions, commercial deals, and personal news often arrived too late to matter. But with the Express, mail could reach San Francisco in just 10 days. Suddenly, Californians were no longer out of sync with the rest of the country. Businesses grew bolder, newspapers could report near real-time updates from across the nation, and families felt tangibly closer. Most importantly, the Union itself felt more connected, which would become absolutely critical as the Civil War loomed. Politically, the Express also reassured the federal government that the West was within its reach. It symbolized national strength and cohesion at a time when fragmentation felt dangerously close. President James Buchanan received regular updates from California during the tense months leading up to Lincoln's election, partly thanks to the Express. Economically, it helped to lay the crucial groundwork for transcontinental infrastructure. The stations that were built across the remote territory became future sites for railroads, telegraph lines, and stagecoach routes. Many of the Pony Express routes would later be absorbed into more permanent communication systems. What was once a bold gamble transformed into the very blueprint for how America would connect itself from coast to coast. And culturally, the Pony Express became the very embodiment of the frontier spirit. Newspapers romanticized the riders, instantly creating heroes. Young men across the country dreamed of taking the reins, galloping through danger with a saddlebag full of destiny. The Express became mythologized even as it operated, capturing the imagination of a country that was hungry for symbols of courage and unity. Even after its conclusion, the Pony Express continued to powerfully shape the American identity. It represented speed, courage, sacrifice, and above all, possibility. In just over a year, it managed to achieve what steamships, Congress, and diplomacy had failed to do: make a fractured, sprawling nation feel like one. The Pony Express did not just deliver the mail. It delivered the future, one gallop at a time. For all its daring and triumph, the Pony Express was, in a sense, doomed from the start. It was not a matter of internal failure. It was a matter of rapidly advancing technology. As fast as a horse could gallop, nothing could ultimately compete with the instantaneous speed of a wire. Just 2 days after the Pony Express officially launched in April 1860, construction began on the transcontinental telegraph, a coast-to-coast communication system that would transmit messages in minutes rather than days. The telegraph poles and lines advanced steadily westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California. Every mile of newly strung wire spelled another nail in the coffin of the Express. By October 24, 1861, just 18 months after the very first ride, the final telegraph wire was strung across the country. The system went live, and the connection was instantaneous. That very same day, the Pony Express carried its last letter. The vibrant silence of the hoofbeats was irrevocably replaced by the rhythmic click of Morse code. But even before the telegraph's completion, the Pony Express was bleeding money. Despite its legendary performance, it was a commercial disaster. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had poured more than $700,000 into the operation and had barely recouped a fraction of that amount. With no federal subsidy and cripplingly high operational costs, for the horses, the riders, the station upkeep, and the complex supply logistics, the Express was never a sustainable business model. It was primarily built as a proof of concept, a bold advertisement for a lucrative federal mail contract that never fully materialized. Russell himself faced a severe financial scandal, and the company began to collapse. By the time the telegraph was completed, the Express was already on its last legs, heroic, beloved, but completely obsolete. Yet the end came with surprisingly little bitterness. The very goal that the Pony Express had set out to prove, that rapid coast-to-coast communication was indeed possible, had been achieved. The riders transitioned to other frontier jobs. The stations were repurposed or abandoned, and the nation turned its eyes toward the future. The fall of the Pony Express was not a failure. It was a poignant passing of the torch. The horse gave way to the wire, just as the wire would later yield to radio, satellites, and the internet. But for one brief, shining moment, America watched in awe as teenage boys and powerful horses conquered time and distance. In a world that was rapidly becoming obsessed with speed, the Pony Express galloped into legend and left hoofprints that no telegraph wire could ever erase. Though it lasted for only 18 months, the Pony Express galloped straight into the mythology of the American West, becoming one of the most enduring and romanticized stories in the nation's history. In reality, it was a risky, short-lived business venture, but in the public imagination, it became something far greater, a potent symbol of heroism, speed, and the relentless frontier spirit. Hollywood, dime novels, and school textbooks transformed the Express into a powerful legend. The iconic image of a lone rider silhouetted against the sunset, thundering across the prairie with a leather mail pouch and a trusty shooter at his side, profoundly captured the nation's heart. This was not just nostalgia. It was national identity in motion. At a time when America was still defining itself, the Pony Express offered a compelling story of bravery, sacrifice, and the unity that is forged through hardship. Figures like Pony Bob, Haslam, and Buffalo Bill Cody became instant frontier celebrities. Cody, regardless of whether he truly rode for the Express, capitalized on the legend in his famous Wild West shows, cementing the image of the fearless teenage courier in the minds of millions of people across the world. The Express became shorthand for grit, daring, and everything that Americans wanted to believe about their pioneer past. Monuments soon followed. Statues of galloping riders now stand proudly in cities all along the old trail, from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and bike paths meticulously trace the original route. Reenactments, museum exhibits, and historical tours diligently keep the memory alive. Even the U.S. Postal Service has issued Pony Express stamps, honoring the brief but bold endeavor that helped to unite the nation. But the story endures for a deeper reason. The Pony Express reminds us of a moment in history when human endurance raced neck and neck with the formidable obstacles of nature, when communication inherently meant risk, and when connection profoundly required courage. It tells us that speed once came not from satellites but from sheer determination and a willingness to ride through snow, desert, and darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream. In our age of instant messages and sprawling global networks, it is easy to forget just how challenging effective communication once was. The Pony Express stands as a powerful tribute to those who bridged impossible distances, not with fiber optics or electricity, but with raw muscle, unyielding grit, and a pounding heartbeat. Its legend remains, not because it lasted, but because for a brief and shining moment, it outran the impossible. The earliest known beer did not come in a frosty mug or a labeled bottle. It came in a crude clay pot in the middle of a Sumerian village thousands of years ago, long before Rome rose to power or the pyramids of Giza stood tall. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerians, were brewing beer in ways that were both simple and sacred, And they were not just drinking it, they were revering it. In Sumerian society, beer was not merely a casual beverage. It was a staple food, a form of currency, a crucial religious offering, and a powerful symbol of civilization itself. It is no accident that the oldest written recipe in human history is not for bread or for soup, but for beer. Found on clay tablets that date back to around 1800 BCE, the hymn to Ninkasi praises the goddess of beer while simultaneously laying out detailed brewing instructions in verse. Ninkasi was not a minor deity. She was deeply revered. To brew beer was to invoke her divine presence. The brewing process was both practical and poetic. The Sumerians would bake a special bread called bapper, which was made of barley and often mixed with honey or dates. This bread was then crumbled into large jars of water and left to naturally ferment. The result was not anything like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, more like a nutritious gruel, and it was essential to daily life. Water in the ancient world was often contaminated, but beer, thanks to its fermentation process, was safer to drink. It was rich in calories and nutrients, and it became a vital part of the diet for laborers, priests, and royalty alike. Workers on temple projects or irrigation ditches were frequently compensated with beer rations, which could amount to several liters a day. This was not an indulgence. It was hydration, nutrition, and morale, all in one. Socially, beer was a communal experience. Rather than drinking from individual mugs, people often gathered around large ceramic vessels and drank through long reed straws, which helped to filter out the sediment. It was not just about getting drunk. It was about bonding, surviving, and even honoring the gods. In many ways, beer helped to define what it meant to be Sumerian. It was embedded in their rituals, their law codes, their agriculture, and their economics. It was liquid civilization, both a daily necessity and a sacred act, and it set the stage for the brewing cultures that would spread across the ancient world, from the banks of the Tigris to the shores of the Nile. If the Sumerians gave beer its spiritual beginning, the Egyptians industrialized it. By the time the Old Kingdom was rising along the Nile, beer had become more than just a sacred drink. It was a pillar of Egyptian society, intricately woven into everything from daily meals to divine offerings and funeral rites. Egyptian beer was brewed on a scale that dwarfed the earlier methods. At large temples and palace complexes, massive breweries operated as an integral part of the state economy. In fact, beer production was often overseen by religious institutions. The Egyptians believed that beer was a gift from Osiris, the god of agriculture and fertility, and it featured prominently in ceremonies that honored deities such as Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and joy, who was often associated with intoxication and revelry. The brewing process was similar to that of the Sumerians but had evolved in both technique and scale. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley was partially baked, crumbled into large vats, and mixed with water. Dates or honey were added for sweetness, and the mixture was left to ferment in ceramic jars. The resulting beverage was thick, unfiltered, and highly nutritious, sometimes consumed with a spoon rather than sipped. Beer was not just for the living. Tombs were stocked with jars of beer for the afterlife, alongside loaves of bread and cuts of meat. Beer was considered so essential that no respectable journey to the next world could be imagined without it. Recipes for the dead, lists of beer offerings to the gods, and murals that showed the brewing process all highlight its profound spiritual weight. But beer also fueled the labor economy. The workers who built the pyramids were not slaves. They were paid laborers, and part of their daily rations included beer, sometimes up to 4 liters a day. This was not an indulgence. It was hydration, nutrition, and morale, all in one. One archaeologist even famously called it the ancient Egyptian energy drink. The state maintained strict control over production and distribution. Taxes were levied in beer, and its quality was rigorously regulated. Women, especially priestesses and temple workers, were often involved in the brewing process, which reinforced its connection to both domestic life and sacred power. In short, beer in Egypt was not a side note. It was central. It nourished the people, pleased the gods, and filled the tombs, and like the Nile itself, it flowed through every part of Egyptian life. Across the ancient civilizations, beer was not just a drink. It was a profound divine communion. Its frothy presence was invited into temples, funerals, and festivals. Fermentation was not seen as a simple chemical process but as a mystical transformation, a true gift from the gods that turned simple grain into a sacred liquid. To brew beer was to intimately interact with the spiritual world, and to drink it was to partake in something more than mere sustenance. In Sumer, the goddess Ninkasi embodied this connection. Her hymn was both a heartfelt prayer and a set of detailed instructions, an act of devotion and a manual for sacred brewing. The rituals likely began with chants to invoke her presence before the fermentation commenced. It is possible that the final beer was shared as part of the temple offerings, given to the priests, and even poured out in libation to the gods themselves. In Egypt, the spiritual use of beer was woven even deeper into the religious fabric. Temples brewed their own beer for daily offerings, sometimes dedicating hundreds of jars at a time. During the annual festival of drunkenness, worshippers celebrated the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction, who was tricked into drinking beer that had been dyed red to resemble blood. The result? Her bloodlust was sedated, and humanity was saved. It is a powerful tale of how beer was literally seen as a force that could tame divine wrath. Priests and priestesses played active roles in the brewing process, and many religious texts mention specific ritual brews that were intended for ceremonies. The presence of beer in funerary rites was also key. It was believed to sustain the soul on its journey to the afterlife. Some tomb inscriptions even list precise beer offerings alongside prayers and hymns. Outside the temples, seasonal festivals often involved large-scale communal drinking. These were not casual parties. They were acts of profound connection between the human and divine realms. Whether celebrating a harvest, honoring the dead, or marking a solstice, beer helped to blur the line between the mundane and the mystical. Even in later cultures, like those of the Hebrews or the Hittites, beer retained its spiritual undertones. While wine gained favor in elite rituals, beer remained tied to fertility, the earth, and the working class, thereby maintaining its ancient role as a sacred and grounding force. In the ancient world, drinking beer was not just about quenching your thirst. It was about aligning yourself with the cosmic rhythms, with the gods, with nature, and with the cycle of life and death. Beer was not just a product of civilization. It may have been one of its causes. Some historians and archaeologists now argue that the very desire to brew beer was one of the driving forces behind the development of early agriculture and the establishment of permanent settlements. While grain was certainly cultivated for bread, the compelling possibility that humans began to systematically cultivate cereals, in part, to make beer is gaining increasing scholarly support. If this is true, then beer is not just a byproduct of civilization. It is one of its foundational pillars. In ancient Mesopotamia, where organized farming first took root, evidence suggests that barley, one of the earliest domesticated grains, was prized not just for its use as food, but also for its fermentable sugars. Once harvested, barley could be stored, ground, and used in the production of both bread and beer. And unlike water, which was often polluted, fermented beer was safe to drink and could be stored for longer periods. This made it essential for early communities, especially in arid or semi-arid regions where reliable water supplies were scarce. Beer production also necessitated a significant level of social organization. Brewing required tools, storage vessels, controlled temperatures, and precise timing. This naturally encouraged a division of labor, technological innovation, and even an early form of scientific understanding. Clay tablets demonstrate that ancient brewers understood the fermentation process well enough to consistently replicate it. No small feat in an age without thermometers or packets of yeast. In urban centers like Uruk and Babylon, breweries became an integral part of the state and temple economies. Rations of beer were regularly distributed to workers, soldiers, and bureaucrats. Taxes could be levied in grain or in beer, and because beer was intrinsically tied to both the economy and religion, its production was closely monitored and regulated. This meant that brewing contributed directly to the rise of bureaucracy, meticulous record-keeping, and the standardization of weights and measures. Beer was also instrumental in the growth of extensive trade networks. Regions with a surplus of grain and brewing knowledge exchanged beer, ingredients, and brewing tools with their neighboring cultures. Pottery jars filled with fermented beverages have been discovered in Levantine and Egyptian trade sites, suggesting that beer was a commodity that was valuable enough to be transported over long distances. In short, beer helped humans to settle, to organize, and to thrive. It fueled workers, connected cities, supported rituals, and justified the cultivation of grain. The frothy beverage was far more than a mere treat. It was liquid infrastructure, literally building the foundation of the ancient world, one sip at a time. Long before breweries were industrialized or complex recipes were meticulously written down, beer was predominantly the domain of women in many ancient cultures. Brewing was not a male-dominated profession, but rather a household art that was practiced almost exclusively by females. And far from being a humble kitchen chore, brewing was regarded as a sacred and highly skilled craft, passed down from mother to daughter like a cherished family recipe. In Sumerian society, beer was so intricately entwined with femininity that even the goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, was female. This was not merely symbolic. It reflected the tangible reality that Sumerian women were the principal brewers in both domestic and temple contexts. Brewing and baking were often performed side by side, and in the early days both involved fermentation. While men typically oversaw politics and trade, women were responsible for producing the food and drink that sustained the household and society as a whole. In Egypt, women continued to largely dominate the brewing process, especially within the home. Beer was brewed in clay vessels using lightly baked loaves of grain, water, and various flavorings. The process was labor-intensive but routine. Many women brewed daily or weekly, not just for their family's consumption but also for sale or trade in the local markets. In wealthier households, female servants or workers managed smaller-scale breweries. Tomb paintings and hieroglyphs often depict women brewing, straining, and storing beer, which clearly highlights their central role in this key part of daily life. Women were also heavily involved in brewing for temples and rituals. Priestesses and temple workers often oversaw the creation of sacred batches that were specifically meant for offerings or religious festivals. In some regions, being a brewer was a source of social status and spiritual influence. These women were not just cooks. They were custodians of a divine tradition. Over time, as societies grew more stratified and beer became commercialized, men gradually began to dominate the public brewing scene. But in the earliest chapters of beer's long history, women undeniably held the reins. They developed the methods, managed the ingredients, and diligently safeguarded this vital knowledge. Interestingly, echoes of this tradition survived into the medieval period in Europe. Many early brewers were alewives, women who made and sold ale from their homes. Some even wore tall hats to be seen in the marketplace, a detail that would later be twisted into the stereotypical image of a witch. But in the ancient world, a woman with a brew pot was not suspicious. She was respected. She nourished both gods and mortals, one bubbling jar at a time. Ancient brewing was not just a matter of luck and magic. It was a craft that was meticulously refined over generations, blending keen observation, practical experimentation, and a deep knowledge of the natural environment. While each culture had its own unique variations, the core principles of brewing were surprisingly consistent: grain, water, fermentation, and time. But it is in the specifics that the process becomes truly fascinating. The primary grain that was used across much of the ancient world was barley, though emmer wheat was also common, especially in Egypt. These grains were chosen not only for their availability, but also because they naturally contained the sugars and enzymes that were necessary for fermentation. The grains were usually partially malted, which involved soaking them in water and allowing them to germinate slightly. They were then either ground into a mash or baked into loaves of bread that were specifically intended for brewing. In both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, these bread loaves, often called bapper and sumer, were crumbled into large ceramic vats that were filled with water. The mixture was then stirred, sometimes briefly boiled, and left to naturally ferment. Wild yeast from the air or from the vessels themselves would trigger the fermentation process. No one knew what yeast specifically was, but they knew that it worked, and that certain vessels consistently yielded better beer, likely because they harbored residual yeast colonies. To sweeten or flavor the beer, the brewers would add dates, honey, herbs, or various spices. Egyptian beer, in particular, was often thick and sweet, almost like a liquid porridge. Filtering was optional. Some versions were consumed with straws to avoid the sediment, while others were so nutritious that the beer was considered a meal in itself, especially for laborers and the poor. Temperature played a key role. In hot climates like Egypt and Mesopotamia, the brewers timed their work carefully and used cool storage pits or shaded courtyards to control the environment. In some cases, the beer was aged in sealed clay jars, while in others, it was meant to be consumed fresh. The brewing tools included large clay vessels, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and sometimes stone hearths for heating. Everything was made by hand, and every batch was slightly different, but the fundamental knowledge was passed down orally or ritually preserved through repetition, song, and prayer, like the famous hymn to Ninkasi. Far from being primitive, ancient brewing techniques were sophisticated adaptations to the local climates, the available grains, and the cultural preferences. They reflect not just culinary skill but an intimate relationship with nature, time, and transformation, a kind of alchemy where simple grain and water became a sacred social elixir. As beer became central to daily life, its role expanded far beyond the household or the temple. In many ancient civilizations, beer was not merely a beverage. It was a form of currency, a valuable commodity, and a crucial economic engine. From workers' wages to state taxes, beer was intricately woven directly into the very fabric of ancient commerce. In Mesopotamia, beer was a key component of the ration system. Workers, including skilled builders, diligent farmers, and even scribes, received daily portions of beer as part of their standard pay. The amount and quality of the beer varied by rank. Higher officials received more refined brews, while laborers typically got thicker, coarser varieties. Detailed cuneiform tablets list these allocations, and thousands of ancient receipts document beer transactions, which is clear proof that it was as important as silver or grain in the economic ecosystem. Beer production itself rapidly became a professional trade. Breweries, which were often attached to temples or large estates, required a small army of laborers: grain collectors, millers, bakers, fermenters, and transporters. Some regions specialized in beer production, creating distinct regional styles and establishing localized trade routes. These beers were not bottled and shipped as they are today, but they could be moved in ceramic jars that were sealed with wax or cloth. Traders would barter beer for other goods like wool, pottery, and olive oil. In Egypt, the picture was similar. Beer was produced on an enormous scale in both urban centers and rural estates. Breweries were often attached to state granaries, and their immense output supported the workers, the soldiers, and the activities of the temples. Beer was meticulously taxed, tracked, and stockpiled, just like any other strategic resource. In times of hardship, beer even served as a vital bartering tool in place of scarce currency. Beer also played a significant role in long-distance trade. Clay vessels with the residues of barley-based brews have been found as far apart as the Levant, Cyprus, and Nubia, which strongly suggests that fermented beverages were exchanged alongside luxury items. While wine would eventually dominate the elite markets, beer consistently remained the people's drink, embedded in every transaction, from the bustling village markets to the official distributions at the temples. Its portability and relative perishability made beer a uniquely local economic product, but one that had national importance. Its production supported farmers, artisans, merchants, and priests alike. It was both daily sustenance and a form of state infrastructure. In short, ancient beer was not just consumed. It was counted, traded, stored, and spent. It helped to build the pyramids, to fund the temples, and to sustain the empires. A mug of beer may have cost a few copper coins, but behind it stood a microcosm of civilization. In the ancient world, beer was the great equalizer. Everyone drank it, but not everyone drank the same kind of beer. Just as with food, clothing, and language, beer both reflected and reinforced the rigid social hierarchies of the time. While commoners sipped thick, hearty brews primarily for survival, the elites transformed beer into a potent status symbol, a ritual offering, and sometimes even a shrewd political tool. Among the Sumerians and the Akkadians, workers were issued daily beer rations. Their brews were dark, unfiltered, and dense, more akin to a stew than a clear drink, but incredibly nourishing. These were functional beers, specifically designed to sustain laborers in hot, arid conditions. Yet even here there was variation. Some tablets mention at least 9 distinct types of beer, which were ranked by their quality and purpose. The better versions were often reserved for scribes, priests, or administrators, which clearly shows that beer was already being used to delineate the class lines. In Egypt, the contrast was even starker. While everyday Egyptians drank a thick, staple beer that was made from emmer wheat and flavored with dates, the wealthy enjoyed more refined brews, lighter, sweeter, and sometimes meticulously filtered. Tomb paintings depict nobles with elegant goblets of golden beer, seated under swaying palm fronds while their servants poured from graceful jars. For the upper classes, beer was not just sustenance. It was an aesthetic experience. Pharaohs and their families received beer offerings daily, often alongside wine and bread. These libations were not mere tradition. They reflected immense power. Only the rich could afford to have a dedicated brewing staff, access to the finest ingredients, and the leisure to enjoy beer recreationally rather than depending on it for calories. Beer also served crucial diplomatic and ceremonial functions. During feasts, treaty signings, or religious festivals, offering a beer of high quality signaled wealth and respect, whereas not offering it could be perceived as a direct insult. Interestingly, the brewing profession itself mirrored this social divide. In homes and villages, women or slaves typically brewed the family's supply of beer, but in temples or elite households, professional brewers, who were sometimes formally trained and salaried, handled the production. The beer that flowed from the temple vats was better regulated, better taxed, and more politically significant. So while beer was universally consumed, its taste, its texture, and its inherent meaning varied wildly depending on who you were. For some, it was daily fuel. For others, it was an expression of divinity, wealth, and refinement, its social status foaming at the rim of every jar. Though thousands of years have passed since Sumerian priestesses chanted to Ninkasi or Egyptian workers sipped beer beneath the shadows of the pyramids, the profound legacy of ancient brewing still lives on in our recipes, our rituals, our economies, and our cultural memory. Beer, perhaps more than any other beverage, connects us directly to the earliest expressions of human civilization. Modern brewing owes an immense debt to the ancient world. Many of the techniques that we take for granted today, malting grain, fermenting with wild yeast, and flavoring with herbs or fruit, were pioneered by brewers who had no microscopes or thermometers. Instead, they relied on intuition, tradition, and tireless trial and error, guided by oral wisdom and a deep spiritual reverence. These methods formed the foundational bedrock of what would eventually evolve into scientific brewing in later eras. The ancient attitude toward beer also subtly lingers in contemporary cultural traditions. In places like Ethiopia, Peru, and rural Eastern Europe, communities still brew beer in ceramic vessels, often meticulously using age-old recipes that have been passed down through their families, echoing the practices of the Sumerian and Egyptian kitchens. In these places, brewing is not just a hobby or a business. It is a profound ritual of community, just as it was 5,000 years ago. The symbolic power of beer has also undeniably endured. Festivals, holidays, and social gatherings around the world still feature beer as a central offering, a drink of celebration, bonding, and shared identity. Even the communal pint at the local pub carries the same spirit as the ancient Sumerian clay pot that was shared by reed straws. Beer as a powerful bridge between people. Academically, the study of ancient brewing has sparked a growing field that is known as bioarchaeology. Using sophisticated residue analysis, scientists have successfully reconstructed ancient beer recipes, brewed them, and even sold them commercially. Experimental archaeology projects have even successfully brewed beer from ancient Egyptian tomb recipes, offering modern people a literal taste of history. Perhaps most importantly, ancient beer powerfully reminds us that civilization was not solely built on conquest, stone, or steel. It was also meticulously built in kitchens and in breweries, by ordinary people who transformed humble grain and water into essential sustenance, a vibrant economy, and a rich culture. It was crafted by women, consumed by workers, and humbly offered to the gods. So the next time you raise a glass, remember, you are not just drinking a beverage. You are participating in one of humanity's oldest and most universal rituals, a profound legacy that has been brewed over millennia and is still fermenting in every corner of the world.